Welcome to our podcast on coaching in higher education. As always, I'm your host, Tim Jansa, a certified leadership and organizational development coach and a higher ed professional of almost 2 decades. One of the most central, but arguably also one of the most complex units on campus is student services. And with the student experience obviously front and center for our institutions, supporting those operations is critical. But how? To better understand student services, as well as its leaders and their developmental needs, I've invited Dr. Kate McCaffrey to be my guest today. Kate is the CEO and founder of Paradigm Twist Executive Coaching and Consulting and has years of leadership experience on campus, including serving as Director of Special Initiatives, Vice President of Student Affairs, and Dean of Students. So let's hear what we can learn from our guest today. Welcome to the show, Kate. It's wonderful to have you on.
Hi, Tim. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So when you and I first spoke, I was struck by how complex the student services portfolio really is. And not just functionally with all its like subunits, talk about advising, housing, financial aid, and so forth, but also in terms of constantly shifting student needs that include also academic support, but also psychological needs and mental health concerns. And at the same time, student services professionals also sit kind of at the intersection of student success, institutional priorities, but also resource constraints. So I can imagine that all this complexity really creates a whole range of challenges for student services leaders. So from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges those leaders face today, and how can coaches help these leaders manage and overcome those challenges?
Sure. I think there are many challenges, so I appreciate you recognizing that. And I think for folks who work in student-facing roles, whether it's called student success, student services, student affairs, student life, campus life, there's lots of different ways campuses choose to frame it or name it. And I think that, for professionals in student affairs or in student services, some of the challenges you mentioned are certainly real. And I think, thinking about how to be agile in the environment is something certainly that we have to do as professionals on a campus. Part of it is, sometimes I used to say we're at the decision-making process of an 18 to 22-year-old if you're on a traditional campus every day. And that was my space, was in traditional age campuses, mostly residential. And so, I think that their brains aren't fully developed, right? So sometimes it's a student decision that impacts our day. And so I think part of it is really having a mindset of how do I still show up as a leader, be a good manager, be a coach to my team, but then also be able to lead and manage when things aren't going well, or response in ways that show me as a leader and a manager and with confidence, I guess, and clarity in the role that I play. And not everyone has those type of response roles, but for many that would call themselves student affairs professionals, they do. And for some of them, they're even like living there with the students. And so when you think about res life, housing, apartment life, those kinds of things, they are living where students are and providing 24-hour care in some ways with whatever public safety campus police entity might be involved as well. And so I think the challenges can be a lot, especially when you're thinking about the 24-hour nature of some of the roles within student affairs.
I'm just blown away, honestly, by the comment you made that you have to work with decision-making processes of 18 to 20-year-olds. That makes perfect sense, but I can also see how that's really difficult for some professionals to adjust to, especially those who might come, from faculty or more from a purely professional background. And all of a sudden, they're dealing with students who are, they're not fully developed, as you mentioned. Another thing that I sometimes say is every 4 to 5 years or so, when in a 4-year college, there's a complete turnover, a complete churn of students. It's new students, new experiences, new expectations, new use of technology, you name it. And so I can see how the agility aspect that you mentioned is super important. How do you help these professionals get into that student mindset that is required to support them in the best way possible?
Well, and I think what's happening the last few years, and I started my company and left my role on a campus in 2019. So it was a pre-COVID decision turned into a COVID decision. So I think, the years of 2020, 2021 were really hard on many people, including student affairs staff on college campuses. And so I think it has changed significantly as a role and a function on campus. And for those of us who've been around doing it for a while, oftentimes we're frustrated, challenged, stressed by others who may not do the work in the same way or be willing to. I think our professional model has changed. And I think with it, the model on campuses needs to change. Certainly, there still needs to be people who are, present and accountable for certain safety aspects and things like that. But I think when it comes to supporting people, it's about what's the best structure and function for this area that's going to meet both the needs of the institution from a strategic priority standpoint, a student success standpoint, and a professional well-being standpoint. I think all of those things need to be taken into consideration. And as a senior leader or manager, that's really hard to do. And so I think coaches can play a critical role. And for me, it's about, I can take the coaching piece and the change leadership, change readiness piece and combine them and integrate them. That helps people learn how to do change better. And in the context of kind of thinking about, are we ready to change? Do we have that capacity? Because I think we're forced to make changes sometimes without having the ready, whether it's ourselves or our students. And what I'm finding more so too is the reaction, right? We're still in kind of response mode and have been for 5 years as professionals on college campuses. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So something else has to change.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because while you were talking about changing the models, anybody who knows higher ed knows also that our institutions are often glacially slow to respond to change.
Yes.
Because yes, the mindset change, the mindset shifts required by the professionals and student services, that's one thing. But then you're also looking at structural changes that are required. For example, I'm just thinking about technologies. That's like the first thing that comes to mind. But also in terms of the way we support our students' mental health and so forth. And again, when that runs into the inertia at our institutions, it can be truly frustrating for professionals who know which directions they want to go, but it might be difficult for them to enact that change. What's your experience with these change initiatives?
So I was always one of those people who would sit in a room talking about implementing some type of technology and looking at the IT people and saying, it should just work together. How come it doesn't work? Yeah. And, I'm a social scientist, not a technology person. And so I think they would, we had great relationships. And so I think that matters too on your campus, even if it's not in your area, but you work together or you're relying on people like the technology people who kind of manage the servers in a basement somewhere has always been a lot of my experience, or they're the ones that are implementing new software packages. Because I do think as higher education, as an industry, there's so much more technology than there ever was. And many of it is student facing. And so we need it to work and work well. And I think sometimes the challenge is that if things don't work well, how do we fix them quickly? If we're struggling with integration of something because we haven't changed a practice or a policy, how do we do that? That's where I think change probably happens. And when people think about change, that's what happens most on campuses is this ever-growing technology and student systems where we used to have file cabinets and landline phones. I mean, I know I'm dating myself by saying that, but I think, for those of us who grew up in that era, now it's very different. And so we've all had to learn different things, and our students likely can do it better than we can.
So you are talking about organizational debt, which
Yes.
is one of my favorite topics, that there's so many policies and processes and workflows and ways of doing things that were established decades ago, but they've never changed. And people then they say, wow, we can't change them because it's always been done like that. Okay, fine. But you're also addressing the issue of silos. When we talk about technology, this issue of systems not talking to each other. This was the bane of my existence, where we had these outdated systems that just simply wouldn't feed into each other, but there was no master system developed, and we were always told that this could be done. So I'm wondering, Kate, when I'm putting myself into the shoes of a student support professional who is charged with helping students navigate these complexities on campus, of where to go and who to talk to and what they need to enter into that system so that something pops up in another system, that requires a tremendous amount of awareness and understanding of how campus actually works. And of course, that totally runs into the siloed natures of most of our institutions. So how do these professionals actually gain that awareness, and how can we as coaches help them with that?
I think it's about where do they start with that awareness? Is it that they need to have more self-awareness first? Is there something I need to learn or do differently in my behavior or how I'm showing up in my presence? do I have the skills that fit my role? Or did I think I want to do this and now I don't that I'm in it? I think is another sometimes a conversation we're having about, is this really what I want to be doing? Is this what I'm passionate about? Is my role changed in a way, or am I in a role where it's not what I really want to be spending time doing? And I think that's one area for coaching. And I think the other is around, how do you onboard people to your organization? We're seeing a lot of transition, and especially in student affairs and student services right now, and have been for a few years. And that's slowing down a little bit given the current economy and the fear around that. But I think for many, it's about how do we welcome them into our community, and how do we treat sort of understanding the culture of the campus and who does what as part of that process. And it can't happen in one session, right? It has to happen over the course of maybe a first year or first semester at least, where they're getting to know people. They kind of have an idea where the resources are. So if I have a question, I know who to ask. And if I don't know who to ask, I know who to ask that will know who to ask. And how do I build those relationships, especially if I'm new? And I think if you're not new, how do you build those relationships with people who are new, so that that interaction can happen more seamlessly and we can work more collaboratively versus in silos, like you talked about?
I mean, this is a common theme in many of the conversations I'm having on this podcast. It always boils down to relationships. That's really the only way to break through these silos and to break through those kind of functional areas where people like to dig themselves in, and because that's where they feel comfortable and they may not feel comfortable elsewhere. What I'm sensing from what you're saying is that student services professionals are maybe more mission and purpose driven, maybe than other units on campus. Is that a misconception, or would you say that's true?
That's an interesting thought. I would say yes. I think because as student affairs professionals, we're tied to the institutional mission and values. And oftentimes for each area, we'll have their own based on what, student activities might have a different one than athletics, which makes sense, right? That they would have a different focus or mission associated with it, but all has to tie to the institution. And that's how I think we create this common vision and common workplace culture that allows people to feel comfortable and to do their job well and to know they're going to be safe and supported in that work. And so I think part of it is understanding the culture first, especially if we're new somewhere, and then if we're in the leadership roles, how do we change that piece of it? Because that's the human behavior part. That's the hardest part, I think, to change, is the culture.
God, you can say that 3 times out loud. That's culture change. I mean, that's a completely different discussion. But again, the culture, I always say, the culture is very much influenced by what we tolerate. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there have to be guidelines and guardrails and all these things. But again, because it boils down to relationships, it boils down to people. So given the big churn, the big turnover that a lot of campuses are feeling on their professional staff side, how can we as coaches help student services leaders hire and onboard the people that have the right fit, that have this maybe mission-driven mindset, purpose-driven, student-centered mindset, who not just there just to do a job and push paper, but really see the greater purpose. And then also maybe build some career pipelines, talent pipelines, because you want to make sure that you retain those people that you hire.
Right. So sometimes I'm having conversations with my coaching clients about if they're searching for a new person to join their team, reframing how they do that. Certainly working within the HR standards, whatever their campus has created, but how do you do that for what your needs are and what your values are as a unit on a campus? And how are you asking those questions, either scenario-based, behavior-based, that can get to the root of that to see how someone will react in that scenario? And I think that understanding and sharing more, because understanding too the candidates interviewing as well. And so how transparent can you be about those expectations at the forefront of an interview process so that then they're not surprised? Like if everyone's showing up on a Zoom interview in a t-shirt on camera, and then the first day they show up, everybody's in a suit and a tie, that's going to be a different expectation. So how are we being very transparent and clear about the expectations around that workplace environment and what we're hoping for? And then as we're bringing on new people, what are we doing to continually do that? And sometimes I'm recommending structuring a staff meeting so that it's not all just information points or updates, because those could be in an email or on a team chat. how do we create meetings that are purposeful and meaningful and help drive towards the vision of the culture that we want? Because we can teach people. We live in learning organizations when we work on a campus, so we can learn too, and especially when we're new to a profession or environment. And I think as leaders, taking the time at the forefront of it and at the beginning of it and having an intentional plan can help save time later when conflicts come up or something's not working or someone decides this isn't for me, I'm going to leave. We all know it costs more to hire someone than it does to keep someone. And then how are we working with them to help them meet their professional goals and thinking about succession planning in our organizations? And I work with some programs that are on campuses that the strategy is how do we develop our own people so that we have people ready to jump into positions when someone else retires or leaves.
I'm so glad you're mentioning this because I almost have given up on certain institutions in terms of their willingness or ability to actually set up real career pipelines and transitions and fostering talent. I've talked to so many folks at institutions, north to south, east to west, and a lot of them, they say, the only way I can move up, the only way I can do anything any different is by leaving and then maybe coming back if I want to, but I really don't want to come back here. So I'm glad that you're reminding us that there are institutions out there that are a lot more proactive about these things, that recognize the not just money cost, but also the cost of losing institutional knowledge when people leave. And maybe this is something you can speak to as well, because we talked about the churn of students every few years. But of course, now that a lot of baby boomers, for example, are retiring, we are bringing new employees in, and they have very different expectations in terms of how they like to work, how they want to be onboarded, how they want to be cared for, how they want to communicate, operate within a team. What's your experience? What are you hearing from your clients, and how can coaching help with that?
Sure. So I do work with a lot of teams as well. I do individual and group coaching plus development as part of the consulting side of what I do. And oftentimes it's about getting people just to understand themselves and how they fit in from a preference standpoint or a strength standpoint. When we think about, I use assessments often to help people get to know each other more quickly and efficiently, which is really helpful when we have data that can help us understand how we're showing up and how others might be reacting to us in that context. I think the other piece too is how are we intentionally having those conversations? And not in a way that something's gone wrong and now it needs to be different, but in a way of here's how we respond when X, Y, or Z occurs. Or here's the expectation about when we're on a Zoom call where all of our cameras are on and we're paying attention. Those types of things being very explicit and clear. I think we have a generation that's working now in that entry and some in mid-level that just want to be told what to do. And I think part of what I work with clients on is both thinking about how do we have this empowerment that allows us to have the confidence to do the work, and how do senior leaders step away from the weeds of fixing and doing because they get pulled in so much to these other situations that usually a vice president wouldn't be involved in a roommate conflict or in a staff conflict or in something that's happened. But I'm hearing that many senior level leaders are being pulled into situations because their managers don't have the skill set or the confidence to be able to address the issues and challenges as they're coming up. And so how are we spending time really talking about, here's the expectation? Because I do think, when I first started, even as a hall director, my first job, I had probably 5 pages that was typed because, it was email didn't quite happen all the way yet. And it was expectations of behavior, right? And presence. And then I would do that the same thing for my students, for my RAs. And I think we've gotten really far away from that because we don't want to tell people how to be or what to do because we could be seen as exclusive if we do that. But I think part of it is how are we meeting people where we're at and bringing them in so it's even a shared value or a shared approach to how we're showing up with each other. And I think I work with clients a lot about taking the time to be intentional about that. And or debriefing when something happens, right? Oftentimes we fix something, we move on to the next thing that needs to be fixed versus say, oh, how did that go? How did that feel for you? What would you do differently next time? Who do we need to engage in differently from a relationship collaborative standpoint? And then are we meeting the needs of the student?
So coaching really as a central and essential leadership competence in a
Hmm.
way, in which way you can also counter what you said, this expectation of I need and I want to be told what to do and how to think. And
Hmm.
I'm wondering, does this also translate to some coaching that might be made available to students? Because I hear once in a while that there are coaching programs established, of course, not as, let's say, fancy and in depth as, the big professional coaching that you and I do with senior leaders, but some that is part of a student support system that students actually acquire these leadership skills, being present, asking questions, again, those things that prevent exactly the kind of issues that you addressed a
Hmm.
minute ago.
And yes, I do think that student affairs, student services staff are in a place of educating and training students in how to be humans and adults in the world, no matter what industry they choose to go into. And oftentimes, through the training or through the experiences that they're having on campus, that's what we talk about is this outside the classroom learning that happens. And some would call them soft skills. They're the hardest skills to do. So I don't know why we do that, but we do. And I think when it comes to, how to have a conversation, how to have a phone call conversation, how do I shake hands when I'm at an event with a board member or I'm presenting my research to them? Because I think a lot of campuses, students are interfacing with lots of different people as they move on in their student career. And so I think the idea of student coaching is certainly grown. I think as we've moved away from academic advisors or class deans at some institutions, now there's people who are called success coaches. I haven't done the work or been trained to do that, but in working closely in sort of assessing and restructuring some academic advising areas to call them student success areas in different ways, we all have different names for them. I think it's about part life coaching, part academic coaching is what that role has become.
I have a dear friend and former chair with whom I have worked. I've mentioned him a couple of times on this podcast. He is now Dean of Student Success. And when he first told me about the fact that he was interviewing for that job, I thought, Dean of Student Success, that's really, really cool. And then I was thinking, gosh, it really depends a lot on the institution, how much attention that institution can actually pay to each individual student. Before that, he was associate dean at the Honors College of a big research institution. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, there you already have kind of like the cream of the crop of
Sure,
the
the built-in.
students, so the
Yep.
resources are more there to support those. And I wonder, how can you do this at a large institution? And again,
Mm-hmm.
how can we as coaches support maybe the establishment of some of these programs?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think at larger campuses, universities, sometimes the structure allows for even some redundancy in services.
Mm.
And so when I work with deans or associate deans who are overseeing, I'm a faculty member and then I become a chair of a department and then I become an associate dean or AVP, provost. And then all of a sudden I'm overseeing 20 people that I used to be peers with and have no idea how to manage people. Some of that too is about how do we not necessarily have redundancy in services, but have redundancy in the resources that I know who I can send my student to. If I'm a faculty advisor for someone because they're in my major, so they're on my advising list, how do I know who else can help them? And I know that the structures are different depending on campuses, but I think for those that haven't changed that structure in a while, or the training they're doing for faculty advisors even, it's time to really look at them. So many students potentially aren't getting the support they need because they don't know where to go or don't know who to ask or don't have the confidence to ask. And so how are we training people not to wait for someone to show up to an office hour or a meeting time or schedule a meeting time? I think that's always the hardest thing. How are we out with students and getting to know them so they can be comfortable with who we are? And I think that's everyone's job on campus.
You just reminded me of something that I spent a lot of time working with and talking with my fellow doctoral students when I was in my PhD program. One of the things we talked a lot about is when you are, for instance, a minority serving institution or an institution that serves underserved communities.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these students may be first generation. They may have nobody in their family who have ever told them what to do, how to approach somebody, how to talk to somebody. Again, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned these kind of essential leadership skills
Right.
when we talked about, supporting students and coaching students around that. So I see how this is again a super important aspect. And I'm wondering, for leaders, what would you say are like the most essential leadership skills that we as coaches can help them develop and hone so that they're ready for whatever's coming their way for the next, 10, 20 years?
I think it's about staying involved too and connecting, whether it's virtually. I think, LinkedIn certainly has a great way to do that now and stay up to date on things. I think it's professional organizations that can be advisors or content deliverers of both training as well as information. Like, I think lots of organizations are doing, here's the update on X, Y, or Z policy that's coming from the government. Here's an update on, and here's how we're going to approach it as your advocacy group. And really kind of connecting is one of the things that I think is important, especially as we rise in leadership. And so I'm often talking, especially with folks who may be mid-level, what's your network look like? And how are you building your professional acumen so that when something comes up or has to change, you at least have some knowledge of it? Or who is on your campus that you can go to that can help you do that, whether it's first gen students. I think many campuses are providing services now, and there are people who are just working on that. At campus I worked on, luckily, we were able to get some grant money to start a program for that. And it was, I think, a Mellon grant. So lots of opportunities, I think, to be creative about how are we meeting the needs of students. And I think some areas around thinking about different groups of people who might come from different countries or different backgrounds, and thinking about how are we creating space where they can feel comfortable from a diversity and belonging and inclusion standpoint is also an area where, if you have a campus that's a large one and a diverse one, how do you meet the needs of all students from an equity perspective? It can be really challenging. And I think many people have specialties in areas where they're working with specific groups of students, whether it's international students, whether it's students who are from a different program. I've worked on campuses that worked with the Posse Foundation, which is a cohort of students that come from a city, and they're part of that program, which is a lot of prep work. And so I think, how do we establish both the services, and then how do we learn for ourselves and engage in the broader industry beyond our campus in order to create those practices that are really going to have the impact we want them to?
So continuous growth, learning, development, relationships, breaking through silos, and also this awareness that you mentioned earlier of where your limits are, where your specialties may lie, where you might have a gap and you need somebody else to kind of fill that in. Again, with the mission-driven mindset, so you can focus on what your students actually need, because again, that changes all the time. As we know, coaching isn't nearly as well established in higher ed as it probably ought to be.
Yes.
There's still a lot of, top-down command and control, decision-making, and so forth. And this whole idea of coaching as a leadership competence, and establishing also coaching programs for mid-level managers, even for deans or even for department chairs, a lot of these units where the rubber kind of meets the road. So if coaching were to become a standard professional development tool for student services leaders, what do you think? What would be the long-term impacts we could expect on student success, institutional culture, and so forth?
Well, one would be retention, right? I think there would be less turnover at that level if we were engaging in developing those people who are in that middle to be able to do the jobs better, to learn more about themselves and grow into a management role. I think oftentimes I'm hearing now is, well, I've never been a manager before. And I think we're not giving training to do that. In our master's programs, I'm not sure we really had the acumen to kind of think about, I'm going to be a manager someday. And when you're managing students or student leaders, it's very different than managing professionals. And I think we're not doing a good job of training them. So training, development, and I think the impact of coaching too can be from someone personally working through whatever challenges they're having in a private way can be really beneficial. I've seen where that transformation can happen. Someone who may have started out and had a rocky start with a team of people, being able to understand why it happened, how it happened, and then how am I going to be different? And I think the other thing too is, how are we recognizing when behavior isn't in the best interest of others around me. And so how are we seeing that, knowing what it is, and being able to address it from the top down in an institution is really important. And so sometimes it's helping people figure out how to address something. That's also solving problems from the human perspective, which I think can be really challenging. So I think those are the areas where the impact can be greatest.
And solving problems from the human perspective, not just by telling and directing, but actually by creating awareness and by creating the motivation and the drive and the momentum to create that inner change first, to really want to change. Kate, listen, thank you so very much. I truly appreciate your time, your wisdom, offering all these wonderful insights from your many years of experience in the field. I learned a lot today, and I hope our listeners as well. So thank you all so much for watching and listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support really means a lot to us. And as well, you can always find more information on this episode, our guest, and today's topic at our companion website at higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. See you next time, and keep making a difference. One client and one conversation at a time. Take care.